Yeah, I'm from the political science department and very proud to be part of this course and talk with you this evening. My name is Björn Rönnestrand at the Department of Political Science, but also at the University of West. So we'll talk about the politics of antibiotic use, which was the title Anne gave me. And then I thought, oh, can I talk about this? Perhaps it's too broad. Yes, it is. I mean, the standard definition of politics will be something about the allocation of resources by authority, so that would be very broad. So I wanted to narrow it down a little bit. So I added another title, which connects a little bit to some of the presentation by some of the earlier speakers at this course, Fredrik and Christian, who talked about collective action a little bit, so I will get back to that. So the second title of this presentation will be then Regulated and Voluntary Collective Action to Fight Antibiotic Resistance. Collective action. Yeah, collective action is something very central to political science. This lady here, Elinor Ostrom, is known for perhaps some of you. She received the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics in 2009. She's a political scientist who simply says that the theory of collective action is the central subject of political science. So if I should talk about anything with you, there will be collective action, obviously. Collective action situations are situations where there is a conflict between the individual short-term interest of any person and the longer collective interest of several people. So when we see this conflict, we have problems. And we see this problem with respect to the use of antibiotics. As mentioned before by Christian and Fredrik already, I will talk about the collective action dilemma of antibiotic resistance. So this very illustrative quote from Lakshminarayan and Heyman from an article from 2012 points out that there is actually little incentive for patient or healthcare providers to consider the effect of their decision to use antibiotics on overall levels of resistance. So we have a problem here. Even if many people know, or perhaps they, or hopefully they know, that overuse of antibiotics leads to resistance. It doesn't matter what they do as individuals. At least that is the point in this quote. It's going to be explained in another by another quote here. According to the logic of collective action, individuals' short-term interest in antibiotic treatment will triumph over the long-term collective objective of an overall reduction. So we have this problem, and we know that these type of problems are quite hard to solve. We can recognize from other large-scale problems such as climate change. You know, it doesn't matter so much what individuals do with regard to driving cars or consuming meat. It's what everyone do together. So we have this typical tension between the individual short-term interest and the longer-term collective interest. And we know that these are really, really tough problems to solve. So I had to think hard about how to deal with them. How can these problems be managed, or at least to some extent dealt with by the means of politics? So this will be the center of attention today, to think about different ways to combat this problem, to manage collective action and promote collective action. Promote these that everyone will benefit in the long run, that is restrictive use of antibiotics instead of overuse of antibiotics. So we have to think today about different means to reach this goal of collective action to fight antibiotic resistance. And we'll focus particularly on two types of, at least in theory, two different types of means of going there. It could be regulated collective action or voluntary collective action. Regulated collective action would be when the state steps in through regulation and limit the use of antibiotics. For example, by the system we have in Sweden, of course, and many other countries, where you need a prescription from a doctor to get antibiotics. But you could also think that it's possible also to some extent to reach collective action voluntarily. People actually, without regulations, sometimes want to limit their personal use of antibiotics or buy less meat or what it could be when it comes to this case. So it's possible to think in at least two ways about this, regulated or voluntary collective action. So I will center around these two approaches, but I will point to the limitations of both of them. So if it looks good now, it will end in a less positive manner at the end. So sorry about that. But that is perhaps building on the tradition of this man here. He doesn't look very like much of a happy-go-lucky type of person, and he wasn't. Does anyone recognize this man? It's Thomas Hobbes, philosopher and political theorist. He wasn't a very positive guy either. He wrote a book in 1641 called Leviathan. Leviathan was a biblical sea monster, and I'll come back to explain more why he named it this book, Leviathan. Actually, in this book he presents his worldview, and it's basically a quite pessimistic worldview when it comes to human beings. He sees them as very instrumental and rational and egoistic persons, and see that without some external third party, there will always be a war going on. Everyone will fight against everyone, so we need a state. He uses a very interesting point of departure for his book, thinking about the imagined state of nature. You heard about that, I guess. Without a state, where there is a war of all against all going on constantly. And people can't live there. People can't live like this. People have to basically cooperate and solve problems of collective action. So therefore, they accept to withdraw some of their liberty and accept the legitimacy of a state. So that's where Leviathan come in, the big sea monster from the Bible. We need a strong enforcer, Hobbes says, that can change the incentive structure for the individuals in favor of cooperation. We need that to solve basically collective action dilemmas. People will never accept to cooperate if we don't have a state who steps in and says you have to do it. That is the basis from much of economic theory, rational choice theory, about how people behave on economic markets is based on the ideas of Thomas Hobbes. It goes back to Thomas Hobbes. So, and this is also something that inspired many political scientists and theories about collective action and the prospect for collective action. Basically saying that, okay, we need regulations. We've got to have regulations or else everything will fail. So the Hobbesian legacy has influenced much of theory about collective action, and simply says that we need regulation. We have to regulate things. We can't solve collective action dilemmas without regulations. Some third party must step in to solve these problems. Usually that is the state. And by means of regulation, changing the incentive structure in favor of cooperation. So politics could be said that it's basically about regulating and creating collective action where it should not take place anyhow. So regulation is important, and this intervention of state is to some extent the core justification of having a state. The state can step in and solve problems of collective action. So that's the reason we have regulations regarding antibiotics, as I said, for example, of having prescriptions for antibiotics in many countries, including Sweden, of course. So this sounds very good. Okay, we have the regulation, we can solve the problem, but the problem is that with regard to antibiotics, a quote from a paper from 2016 says that regulatory aspect may very well be only existent on paper, but not properly implemented at all, or the adherence to specific aspect might not be enforced. It means that, okay, if Hobbes, based on the Hobbesian logic, okay, we should have regulation limiting the use of antibiotics, but in many instances that we have regulations in place, but they don't work very well because they are not enforced, they are not implemented. So going on with another quote, more specific with the link between corruption and antibiotic use. This is a quote from the former Romanian health minister, who says that corruption generates antibiotic resistance. In societies where there is corruption, rules are broken, therapy guides and protocols are not respected, pharmaceutical drugs are released without prescriptions, measures to isolate patients infected with multi-resistant germs are not respected. And this man should know what he's talking about, because the levels of antibiotic use is very high in Romania and levels of corruption is extremely high in Romania. So this guy should know about this. So this point is interesting to thinking about. Is there a link between corruption and antibiotic use? So actually me and a colleague wanted to study this. So we made a study focusing on the associations between corruption and consumption of antibiotics in European regions. So we thought that this is interesting. There might be a link here. So we used some data from the special Eurobarometer survey from 2009 and correlated that with the European Quality of Government Index. Someone heard about that? It's a survey that measures in very great detail factors related to quality of government and quality of healthcare and quality of the police and school in the regions of Europe. You know, Europe is divided into these small regions in every country. So this survey is used to measure the quality of government around Europe, very interestingly, and there is large variation when it comes to such things as corruption and transparency or these type of things, or the prevalence of bribes in society. Very large variation, also within countries. So okay, perhaps you would know that there is variation, and luckily the Nordic countries are low when it comes to corruption, but we see more corruption in some southern countries in Europe. But actually there is also very large variation within countries. So it's interesting to think about these regional variations. We want to study if this regional variation of corruption is linked to antibiotic use. Because there is also quite large regional variation in use of antibiotics, also in Europe. In some countries, for example Italy, we see very high antibiotic use in Sardinia, but very low in some of the northern parts. So the idea here was to actually study this and see if we could find some correlation and see if the health minister was right in saying that there is a link. So we did this with also some confounders, try to adjust for some potential confounders, such as the prevalence of physicians in these regions, and also economic condition, the regional GDP. So I would not give you the details about the confounders, but we found this interesting correlation at least. So it's hard for you to see, but here on this x-axis we see corruption in the healthcare sector, and on the y-axis antibiotic consumption, and all the things you can't read is regions around Europe. I think it's about 150 here or something like that. And you can see at least there is a lot of variation, but generally it seems that more corruption in the health sector is linked to more consumption of antibiotics. So quite interesting result. We see that there are some, as I said, variations. Some of these countries where you see to the left, below, lower part of the left side of this graph, are regions in Romania, Romania. Some regions in Romania who are very poor and perhaps doesn't afford to use so much antibiotics. So it's not a perfect line, but it's interesting correlation. And we find actually the same thing if you also instead measure prevalence of bribes in society. That's the same thing. More bribes in a society, more antibiotics use. And also, this have also been found, this correlation been noticed at the national level also in a study by Collegion and colleagues, found the same at the national level. But this time, it's control of corruption, which is measured, but also this is actually not antibiotic use, but antibiotic resistance. But quite strong association. Very interesting. So these two findings do highlight a link, of course, between corruption and antibiotic use and antibiotic resistance, but these studies were not designed to actually study the mechanism. So what we don't know so far is why do we see this association? So we have to think more, and I would love your help if you will give me some suggestions. Why do you think this association seems so relatively strong and consistent? So you have a...
Actually, I raised my hand for a question before you ask the question. On the slide before, what unit do you measure control of corruption?
It's a standardized measure. It's quite hard to, but more corruption, higher quality of government, lower corruption on this side, and more corruption on that side. So it's a standardized, measure.
I suppose there are a lot of parameters.
Yeah.
Is there a way that we can find those, or do we have to go through the article maybe?
You can easily find them in the article, and I think it will be available as a link to this study. It's an interesting study. It arose quite much discussion also when this was released. But it's less corruption and more corruption. So interestingly, not only antibiotic use, but also antibiotic resistance. But the question that I would like you to help me with, why do we see these relations? Could we trust the Minister of Health, former Minister of Health in Romania? Or have you other?
This is a question about regulations. If you show us the picture again, if you compare to the different countries here, I'm a banker, so I'm not in this area. But if you look at Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Netherlands, Norway, etc., and Germany, for example, which are on the right side, they are quite heavy regulated countries on everything, not only on antibiotics, but on everything. And it goes for corruption, it goes for regulation within banks, it goes for governmental regulation, etc., etc. And on the other side, you do have less regulation.
Interesting.
In every aspect, I mean.
I'm not perfectly sure about that view. I would say that many of these countries that we see on the left are very highly regulated countries. But you may be right. But it could be more specific also related to how much is antibiotic use regulated.
Yeah.
And so there is a study who looks particularly on this. how regulation of antibiotics is related to resistance and use. And they find that, okay, it's generally that if you have certain regulation in place, then you see less use and more prudent use of antibiotics. But they are surprised, actually, the researchers in this study, and find that this regulation is so weak, this correlation is so weak. So even if you have regulation in place that, in theory at least, should result in less use of antibiotics, this doesn't happen for some reason. So that could be one of these mechanisms, that if you have very high prevalence of corruption in a country, then regulations and prescriptions are not respected, and people doesn't care about them. So they are there on paper. We have regulation, but we have also bribes. This could be both, for example, in relation between healthcare providers and big pharma companies. So we know if there's a lot of corruption in the healthcare system, there might be hard to get track of these connection between physicians and pharmaceutical companies. It might be that, but it might also be the relation between patients and physicians, so that people might expect, in many parts of Europe, there's a lot of illegal payment and unofficial payments in the healthcare system. So if people pay the doctor basically for things they should have for free, then perhaps they expect something back. So it could be that mechanism as well. But we are not sure, so we have to think more about this. But this is interesting. It points to this limitation of the problem, at least, when it comes to regulating antibiotic use. In many countries all over the world, we have so much corruption, especially in the healthcare sector, that it's actually quite hard to using regulation to limit antibiotic use. So the regulation approach might fail. What about that? Low quality of government account for some of the between-region country variation and antibiotic use resistance in Europe is to summarize these two studies. So simply that if we have low quality of government, much corruption, okay, it seems that we also have more use of antibiotics and more resistance. So the take-home point from this part so far will be then that regulating collective action in high corrupt societies is a challenge, and also when it comes to the collective action dilemma of antibiotic resistance. Did you raise your hand or only? Nope.
Sorry.
So any questions or comments or something? Please interrupt me if you want.
Is there a study made for the rest of the world? Is there a correlation between other countries?
Good questions. It would be very interesting to do that, actually. The problem would be that I think both when it comes to data on antibiotic use and resistance, we have limitations. We have quite good data in Europe and perhaps some other parts of the world as well when it comes to antibiotic use, but we lack data when it comes to, for example, Africa and Asia and so forth. And we also lack good data when it comes to corruption and quality of government. But actually we have some data coming in now from Transparency International that will be interesting. If we could perhaps get some rather good, acceptable good data when it comes to antibiotic use, we could check if this holds for other continents as well. So that's a very good point. I would be happy to do that, but I haven't had the time yet. So.
How about USA?
Yeah. USA, I think there is variation in the use of antibiotics when it comes to the states. And we have looked a little bit on it, but the problem is that there's not that much variation in corruption. But some variation, it's possible to see it, but should also look into that more. So very good questions. You have a question?
Healthcare system or in the meat industry, where I know that a lot of the antibiotics uses?
Very good question. I don't know. Could be both. Yeah, for sure it should be interesting to look more into the meat industry. We know that the incentives are not in place when it comes to overuse of antibiotics.
Because I think that a lot of the antibiotics used in the meat industry is in the more corrupted European countries.
Yeah, that will be super interesting to look into. Good suggestion, thank you. Okay, so sad news about regulations. But over to Ostrom again, my favorite political scientist, who says that self-governance is possible. And this is actually the picture from when she received this prize in 2009. Self-governance is possible. She's in favor of self-governance instead of regulations. And actually she points out the failure of the Hobbesian standard prediction for collective action. She says actually that, okay, Hobbes said that without regulation, no cooperation. And Ostrom says, that's not true. We know from many studies that actually cooperation can evolve and persist also without the state. Ostrom studied many of these commons, natural resources in which actors come together and work together in collective action to sustain certain natural resources. So Ostrom's research and other researchers within her field has actually demonstrated that the Hobbesian standard prediction for collective action is wrong, that people can overcome the free rider problem and cooperate without the state. Sometimes, specifically if there is small scale or medium scale interaction, small groups can come together, exchange promises, build trust, and cooperate. And that could also hold for medium-sized collective action situation. But is it possible to use these type of, to escape the Hobbesian prediction also in large-scale situations? When it comes to antibiotic use, we have this large-scale collective action dilemma. Basically, the globe, I guess, in the long run, at least, so that everyone will have to cooperate. Is it possible to promote collective action voluntarily without the state? Will people accept to give up some of their immediate self-interest to work together to address this global problem? So that will be interesting to think about. So we know also from prior research that certain aspects of societies are important and can promote collective action. Norms such as trust and reciprocity is known to stimulate collective action. And this has been developed a lot by a political scientist called Robert Putnam, who studied basically Italy and the regions of Italy and found that in certain areas there were abundance of these strong networks built around trust and reciprocity, and that people in these regions could develop credible commitments and cooperate and solve dilemmas of collective action. If you trust other people and think that they will cooperate, people are willing oftentimes to do that themselves. So it's interesting to think if we could translate these findings. Is it possible that trust and reciprocity might stimulate people to voluntarily take part in collective action and limit their use of antibiotics? So I and a colleague wanted to study this. Could we perhaps find proof that if people trust others and if there is reciprocity, people accept to limit their personal use? So we thought about ideas of investigating this, and we ended up in doing this type of scenario experimental studies, where people read short scenarios and then they are asked questions. So I will talk about this study. So in this study we handed out scenario vignettes online to a large group of people, and they were about to read this scenario. imagine that you suffer from a respiratory infection and you consulted a physician who prescribes antibiotics to you, but the doctor encourages you to wait as long as possible to collect and use the medication in order to see if the disease heals by itself. So, okay, you have antibiotics, but it's better if you wait and see this might heal. So then you don't need it. And in the scenario also, it's explained that antibiotic resistance is a societal problem and that it compromises the treatment of infections where antibiotics is necessary. But the doctor says that about 2 out of 3 of all patients wait at least 1, 3, or 5 days to begin antibiotic treatment. So basically, we varied the number of days that the doctor says that that most people wait. So in 1/3 of the scenarios, we told people that people usually wait 1 day. Then they go and collect their antibiotics. And in the other treatment, we said 3, and the third treatment was 5 days. So people will basically usually wait 5 days and then see if not healed by 5 days, they go and collect their antibiotics. You want to study if this influences how people think about their own decision. So the manipulation in this experiment was the number of days, as I explained to you, 1, 3, or 5 days. And then we measured the number of days respondents themselves would accept to postpone treatment from 0 to 7 days. And we also measured something that is called generalized trust. So if we say that this is an indication, the first one, the number of days, is an indication of reciprocity in a way. If other people reciprocate, then theory says that we will do it myself. And the other indicator, generalized trust, is a question related to how people see other people. Do people generally trust other people? It's quite vague question, unspecified question, but the question is, in your opinion, to what extent can people be trusted in general? So we asked this question as well. We know that these two indicators are important components of social capital. The thing Putnam discovered was important for collective action in Italy. So we wanted to find out if, okay, is this in a way linked to people's willingness to limit their personal use of antibiotics? So, and the finding was that both trust and reciprocity was linked. If people was told that people waited 5 days, most people waited 5 days to collect their antibiotics, then there was quite much higher degree of willingness to wait. And also what we measured, the general trust question. In your opinion, to what extent can people be trusted in general? Those people who believe that other people are to be trusted, those can accept, okay, I'll wait. Perhaps they think also that I trust other people to do what they can, and therefore I want to contribute to collective action to limit antibiotic resistance. So good news. It might be that Ostrom criticizing Hobbes and saying that, okay, perhaps we can trust people to voluntarily take part in collective action. Then we can escape this dilemma. People will accept by themselves only if they know that we have a problem and, okay, we have to solve this together, then it might work. The problem, though, voluntary collective action might work in some part of the world where we have high trust, norms of reciprocity, but the problem is that that's quite rare. That's the bad news. This study was conducted in Sweden, and we know that the Swedes and the Norwegians and Danes and people from Finland, the Nordic countries, we have a high amount of trust. We have trust in our institutions, political institutions and regulatory institutions. We trust them, and we trust other people. So in the end, it might be difficult to go along the Ostrom road. It might work, but we know also that trust is scarce in large part of the world. So bad news also for Eleanor Ostrom, sadly. So it might work in some occasions, in some locations, but probably not in others.
I have a question. We can't see these numbers, or I can. How big a difference is it between the white and the dark blue?
It's very large.
Very large, okay.
And that's quite strange in a way, that we see so much variation. We have, generally, if you ask the question in Norway, which I think is number one in trust around the world, I think something about 80% will say yes, if you have yes or no alternatives. And that number will be 15 or 10 in some countries in Europe. So it's very large variation with regard to trust. But this is also, I mean, I must also say that it's problematic it's a problematic indicator to some extent because it's very vague. But on the other hand, we know that these type of indicators also are very correlated to other values that we other important factors that we can connect to trust. So it's an indicator that it's a little vague and unspecified, but it's still we know that it matters for the things that we value. You have a question?
In a lot of the countries with low trust, it's more that they're very family-based as opposed to the general society trust of the northern countries, where in, for example, Italy there, you have really close-knit families, and then they don't trust anyone outside of the family. So it's not so much that they don't trust anyone as it is simply that they trust less people more. So I think you could still spread these ideas there. You just have to take it into each group.
Good point. Very good point. That's true. And we can also measure in surveys the amount of trust you have for your relatives and compare it with the number of the trust you have in generalized trust. But the sad news is that generalized trust and particularized trust goes quite much hand in hand as well. I know there is a difference, and I agree with you that this also, but to some extent, correlates very nicely with this type of different family structure and how the welfare state is organized as well. But your point is good. But you might also recognize that we basically see the same pattern as we see when it comes to corruption. If you would draw a map about the level of corruption, it would look basically the same. So the problem here is also that we have all these problems gathered together, so to speak. So if you have good institutions, you usually also trust other people, and that's logical, because if you have strong institutions, you have the police and you have an enforcer and a society that can mostly at least stand up for you. So this goes hand in hand. I'm going for the end now. To summarize this, we began talking about this collective action dilemma of antibiotic resistance, something that was brought up also by Christian Munthe and Fredrik Karlsson. And I talked and said that collective action situations are very important in political science, and it's about the conflict that sometimes occur between the individual self-interest and the longer-term collective interests. And these problems are very common in all social settings, and also goes for climate change, it's the same problem, and as antibiotic resistance. And I took some quotes and pointed out that there is little incentive for each patient or healthcare provider to consider their use of antibiotics because it's have only limited influence on the overall level of resistance. So we have this problem of collective action that we have to deal with in certain ways. And I talked about two way of thinking about this, regulated collective action, where we have a third party and regulation that promote collective action, and also the other idea that it might be in certain occasions possible to promote voluntary collective action. I pointed out problems with both of them. The Hobbesian idea that we have to have a strong state and tell people what they should do and have regulations in place. You should not use more antibiotics. You should limit your overuse now, so we can keep this common good for the future. But I also pointed out the limitation here, that this strong state isn't that strong. Thinking about low quality of government, corruption, and especially in the healthcare sector where there's a lot of corruption. So these regulations that we need might already be there, but they are not respected and not implemented. So therefore, it's a problem of going this regulation Hobbesian way. Of course, we can always think about new way of increasing transparency and fighting corruption in the healthcare, but we know that this is a serious problem. So unfortunately, perhaps this is difficult. But I also highlight the prospect of voluntary collective action. We know from prior literature that in some occasion people come together and fight and promote and engage in collective action voluntarily. And we know that if people trust other people, if there is norms of reciprocity, people are in networks, we know that collective action can take place. So we wanted to study, and I talked about this study about the link between trust and reciprocity, and that, okay, if we see this, that other people contribute, and if you trust other people, okay, I'll go for this, I will cooperate, I'll wait and see if I don't need to use antibiotics. So that will be a potential solution. But on the other hand, we know that, okay, trust is widespread in some part of the world, but not in others. So it might be difficult also to find a way of finding collective action voluntarily. So difficulties when it comes to both regulated and voluntary collective action, unfortunately. So to sum up this, I guess at the end of the day we need different solutions. I don't have the solutions, but I guess thinking about the problem of regulation and the problem of voluntary collective action, we need multiple and many different types of political solutions to promote collective action to fight antibiotic resistance. Questions and comments, please. Thank you.
In one of our earlier sessions, we talked about incentives. For instance, in Cyprus, the vets are on economical gain if they prescribe more antibiotics. What about, I mean, you describe sort of two ways, and you promote possible other ways. So what about the possible other ways to regulate the pharmaceutical incentives to pay for the more you use, the more you gain in your personal economy as a vet?
Very good question. I wish I could answer. I don't know. It's difficult, I guess. It's difficult to regulate a very corrupt sector. But how to do it, I don't know, basically. But it's very important.
Actually,
question.
Is this actually a case of corruption? Because it's...
No. From the beginning, we don't have the incentives in place. And then we need some new regulation, new institutions. But if we know that we already, from the beginning, have a sector that's full of corruption, it would be difficult even to perhaps change the incentive structure, because but it's possible. I guess it's at least better if these incentives weren't in place. I know I've heard about this Cyprus case, and I think the same goes for antibiotic prescriptions in China, in some parts of China, where you also see this, that physicians gain from prescribing antibiotics. So for sure we need new institutions we need hopes to come and say, no, no, no. But we also have to think about that in reality, it's difficult to change things.
Other questions? No, thank you.